Hello everyone, welcome back to the course on Health Humanities, Indian and Western Medical Knowledge Traditions. This is week number 6 and lecture number 26. And this lecture is titled as Introduction to Mental Health. In this lecture, I will talk about what is mental health and what are its different forms, different patterns, how it has evolved, what is its history, what is its social aspect, cultural aspect, and then I will talk about different forms of mental illness and different ways through which it can be healed. When we think about mental health, it is about the overall well-being of one's emotional, physical, social, and psychological well-being. It is not just about the psychological, it is also about physical, mental, and overall health of the person. Suppose a person who is physically in pain, and then the person will not be having any kind of mental peace. So in this lecture, I will talk about what is mental health, the science of mental health issues, its a social aspect, its a evolution, the stages of psychic dissolution, and I'll then pick up a case of mental health which Freud has discussed, and then I'll talk about that. I'll talk about mental illness in the context of psychology and what are different factors like social, cultural, historical factors that constitute mental illness. And when we think about mental illness, then one has to first consider what is mental health and then look at the idea of illness next to it. So mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It also includes physical well-being. And it is the concept of mental health which has different parameters when we look at the different philosophical as well as social structures in different countries. In the Indian context, mental health is about being in one's self. It is also the balance of physical as well as psychological aspect of one's body and mind. In other words, mental health is about being in or being within one's self, where one is residing in one's body. And so over here we have the idea of physical body being associated with the idea of mental health. However, in certain other cultural contexts, mental health is not part of the body. Rather, body and mind have been seen as two opposite organs, two opposite aspects, and they do not have any connection. So it is the idea of mental health. If a person is mentally fit, mentally sound, it will determine how one thinks, feels, acts. In other words, the mental health or mental illness affects our day-to-day activities, our thought process, and our actions. Further, mental health also determines how we handle stress, relate to others, how we make our relationships, how we communicate with other people, and how we make our healthy choices. So mental health has a major part, major role in our day-to-day activity and our entire life. If a person is not mentally fit, then it will affect not only his day-to-day activities, but also the choices he or she will make and the decisions the person will be taking. Everything will be impacted and affected by mental health. When we think about the idea of mental health, then one has to also consider the some of common mental health disorder, and which can be seen in the form of depression, tension, anxiety, and these are also further part of mental disorder, psychiatric disorder, psychological disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, mental disease, mental breakdown, nervous breakdown, and so many other forms. So when we think about the modern names, the contemporary terminology which defines mental health, then it has a lot of specific terms, specific names, which determines the particular state of mind, the particular mental condition of the person. Each has its own specificities, its own features. And in this way, mental health is a very broad and very wide area. It needs a deeper study to understand all aspects of mental health and mental well-being. When we think about mental health, mental illness, it is always associated with mental well-being, because any kind of treatment for any kind of cure for these kind of disorders will lead to mental well-being, mental peace. When we think about what are the signs, what are the symptoms of mental health issues, how could a person know that somebody is suffering from some kind of mental disorder? Are there any kind of physical symptoms? Are there any kind of symptoms that can determine the condition of one's mental health? Then we find that there are a number of ways through which one can determine. It can be in terms of one's behavior, one's actions, as well as how one lives, how one spends one's time, and what are the changes in one's behavior, and so many other aspects. And some of the signs of mental health issues are excessive worrying or fear. When a person is excessively worried or excessively feared about certain things, or when a person suddenly feels sad or low, when a person has extreme sadness, or if he finds no hope in his life, or a person is having swings in his or her moods. So these mood changes, the sadness and the lowness, the idea of fear, they describe how a person feels, and that will determine about the mental condition, the mental well-being of the person. The mental well-being of the person can also be known, can be found from how he lives, how he behaves with his friends. If he or she withdraws from his friends and lives a life of isolation, it means the person has certain kind of mental health issues. Moreover, the person who have mental health issues, they will be also having the physical symptoms of tiredness, physical symptoms of low energy, and the other symptoms of mental illness are agitation, anxiety, depression, mania, paranoia, and psychosis. So there are multiple ways through which one can know whether a person is having certain issues with his or her mental well-being. When we think about the social aspect, so mental health has its association with social and cultural aspect. How? Because the person who is mentally ill, they get stigmatized, they get shamed, and their identity is constructed in different ways, which which are called abnormal, quote unquote, or which are seen as something unfit. So the idea of insanity, abnormality, as well as something which is stigmatizing the person's life is called the social aspect of mental illness. Mental illness is something which is based upon how a person is being treated in the society, and how, and if the treatment is in terms of not accommodation but exclusion, if it is not in terms of taking care of the person but but seen as a form of punishment, then the situation has become terrible socially. So mental illness or insanity provide certain kind of knowledge about themselves. What does knowledge means about themselves? Here, knowledge means that one creates some kind of discourse, certain kind of aura about the person, which portrays the person positively or negatively, or it tries to segregate and isolate the person. So when we think or discuss about insanity, punishment, or mental illness, then one has to actually examine certain ways of talking, certain ways of saying certain things which are thinkable, sayable, and what are the other ways which have been excluded. Further, the idea of mental illness has been personified as well as defined in a set of vocabularies, and they can be negative, they can be something which are socially exclusive, or something which are derogatory. And these terms, which are these discourses which have been used to define a person, are the madman, the hysterical woman, the criminal, the deviant, the sexually perverse, and so many other terms which are used to construct the knowledge about the person, and in this way to rule over them or to dominate over them. If it is so, then when and how one speaks of psychological illness, what are the conditions where one talks about one's mental illness or psychological illness, and how does one talks about? When we answer the question when, then we notice that this is difficult when one talks about it. In most of the society, there is no space for talking about or accepting one's mental illness. It largely remains silent. It largely remains within the four walls. There are very few people who consult doctors, who inform their friends and talk openly about their psychological illness. They fear social stigma, they fear social isolation, and hence the idea of when are difficult. How do people talk about their mental illness? That is another bigger question, because when people talk about their mental illness, they are always in a defensive position, or they are having problem with expressions, because they may fear that they will be objectified, they will be defined in a particular way. Further, one has to think about the relationship between organic pathology and mental pathology. And here the problem is that how one examines mental illness based upon the experiences of bodily wounds, something which affects the mind, or some kind of inner turmoil. And these are the issues of debate in psychology and sociology. Medicine has different aspects, different notions about this. But in psychology and sociology and different other discourses, these involves that if it is organic pathology, then it is less stigmatized compared to mental pathology. When we think about the evolution of mental illness, then it is not against nature. Rather, mental illness is a part of nature, but generally we accept is something different, something which is against nature. Freud has talked about the evolution of mental illness in terms of the libido, its development, its successive fixation, and the consequent pathological possibilities of the individual. The idea of libido implies certain kind of oppression or suppression of sexual desires, and then what kind of form or how it develops further, how these oppressions are suppressions are expressed, how they develop, and when are they fixated if they do not find any means of expression, and finally how they turn into some kind of a pathological illness for the person. For Freud, it first begins in the child in the form of like asking food or some kind of oral pleasure through mouth, and then it moves to the second stage of the system of aggressive defenses, where the person will defend what he or she is doing, and they will move to the third stage of erotic activities, and then come to the fourth stage called object choices, where the person will have his choices in terms of like what he or she decides that will lead to the development of mental well-being and or mental illness. Michel Foucault talks about 6 different stages of psychic dissolution. The first stage he calls neurosis, which is an initial aspect of psychological dissolution. And he says that neurosis marks the earliest stage of psychological breakdown, which disrupts not only the balance of the personality, but also releases unconscious emotional complexes. And what are the different forms of neurosis? The different forms of neurosis are repression, regression, reaction formation, how a person reacts to other person to a very normal behaviors, very normal responses, isolation, undoing, projection, introjection, turning against the self, turning against oneself and harming oneself, or reversal, turning against other people and trying to harm them. The second stage is paranoia. And in paranoia, the person is having mood disturbances, which amplifies his or her personality in different ways. And it doesn't actually impair the clarity, logic, or mental organization of the person. The third stage is dream-like state and the conscious dissociation, and where dream disrupts the person's reasoning and perception. It allows some kind of illusions and hallucinations, which usually people see in their sleep. So what happens in like dream-like states of the dissolution of psyche, that the person like who is having this problem, the person won't be able to identify what he or she has witnessed in the dream is it real or is it something fictional? Or is it something which has happened in dream? So the person won't be able to differentiate between whether the thought which has come to the person is something real or something in dream. The fourth stage is mania and melancholy. It talks about instinctive affective breakdown, which involves emotional regression. It involves or brings euphoric outbursts and causes further despair and detachment. The fifth stage is schizophrenia, which causes confusional states, which brings confusions. It is a point where the person is having cognitive fragmentation, where a person is losing one's thinking power, or his remember, or his what you call power of expressions. And the last stage is dementia, which is loss of memory, and the person is having complete personality dissolution. In dementia, the person will not remember anything sometime or what he or she has done a moment before. And so Foucault talks about these 6 types of psychic dissolutions of mental illnesses. However, they are also constructed by social aspect and cultural aspect. Moving further, when we think about mental illness in the individual context, while considering these 6 larger categorizations, mental illness can have a very what you call basic individual history, which means one has to actually make a case study of one's life and then examine how a person feels or what are the reasons of a person's behavior or why a person reacts in a particular way. In this regard, Sigmund Freud makes a case study of a woman who is suspicious about her husband's extramarital affairs. Later on, it was revealed that she was having jealousy with her husband because she herself was willing to have extramarital affair with one of her relatives. Another reason for mental illness can be revenge. The revenge can be on oneself, the revenge can be on other. And the idea of the motive of revenge further causes mental illness. And this revenge can be because of one's past actions, which has led to the person some kind of suffering and pain, or it can be some other reasons. Further, Freud talks about how to deal with these personal life experiences, how to deal with one's emotions, how to deal with one's suppressed emotions, something which have become hidden and not known to the other people, but it is internally disturbing the people. In this regard, Freud says that one can actually transform one's emotions, one can substitute it, one can actually condense it in symbols, or it can be metamorphosized in something else. So what does this mean? For example, when a person is having certain kind of the suppression of some desires, and then the person can substitute the desires to something elevated, which can be expressed in a better way in a society. One of the means of substitution is in the form of narrativizing, in the form of telling stories, or transforming into literature, making it a form of a story or a poem. Or it can be condensed into symbols, so reducing one's personal desires to some complex symbols so that it's not easily accessible to others. And if it is not managed, if it is not transformed, substituted, then it will cause anxiety and fear that will lead to widening of mental illness, deepening of mental illness. When we think about mental illness in terms of psychology, how does a person who is having mental illness treats himself? How does he behave with everyone else around? One can actually have loss of trust in oneself. One can actually harm oneself, which means one can avoid oneself, avoid self-recognition. In other words, one can consider oneself worthless person. So the avoiding self-recognition means where a person is not finding any kind of worthiness in oneself, or one is harming oneself. The second aspect can be that the person isolates, he spends a solitary time, he remains aloof with other people, he detaches with everyone else. Next, if a person is having mental illness, the person may have delusions, hallucinations, or it can cause schizophrenia and the state of dementia in the person. When we think about the historical constructions of mental illness, what I said earlier, the social and cultural aspect of mental illness, one has to go back to the Middle Ages, the Elizabethan age in early Renaissance in the context of Western countries, where mental illness was seen as something that it is a source of wisdom, source of knowledge, and the people who had some kind of mental illness, they were not isolated often. However, this idea of or this understanding of mental illness disappears in next 2 centuries, and the madhouses, asylums, and confinements were built to imprison the people with mental sickness. I have already discussed about madhouses, asylums, and confinements in the context of Western medical knowledge traditions, so I will not deal in detail about this. About social and public spaces, one has to consider how the people with mental illness have been treated, and we find that they are usually boycotted, they are avoided, neglected, and they are made to be they are made to perceive themselves as someone who are inferior, mentally inferior or psychologically inferior. So to conclude, when we think about mental illness, one has to consider how to reduce stigma and how to reduce some kind of social, cultural, religious stigmatization which is put upon the person who is having mental illness, and find out mechanism to support them. One has to consider how mental health and normalcy are socially constructed parameters, socially constructed hegemonic norms. And so what we suggest over here, that one has to critique normalcy, and then there are certain other places that the persons who are having mental health issues, then they can work on the idea of scriptotherapy or writing therapy or storytelling therapy, which can be in terms of what Freud calls sublimation. So there are different ways through which one can heal with their mental health issues. So with this, I'll end this lecture. Thank you.